All right, welcome everyone to our Bloom PGC Open Mic Night for May 2021. And we're excited today to have University of Maryland Extension with us. And our first speakers are Jonathan Kays and Luke McCulley, and they're gonna kick it off with some wildlife management advice and support for us. So I'm gonna turn it over to you guys. Thanks for being here tonight.
Okay, hey, thanks a lot. I'm actually a forestry extension specialist. I work out of Western Maryland Research Center, but I work statewide. And Luke is, you might introduce yourself. He is the
wildlife management specialist for University of Maryland Extension. I just joined on in a new position just last August, so I'm new and I'm learning a lot. And under the kind tutelage of Jonathan, who's been doing this for much longer and has a very good depth of experience in Maryland. I come most recently from California, so I'm learning a lot about the local wildlife management issues, and looking forward to sharing what I can and helping to support Jonathan in the Q&A.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Luke. So yeah, I've worked with deer and vole management specifically, as well as other types of wildlife for a number of years. And you know, we all have moved on in time. I may have to skip over some of the stuff I have, and because of time, but it's about 40 minutes of kind of covering a range of topics. And I put some resources in there as well that you may want to take a look at. I'm sharing my screen here. All right, so. And it's interesting to hear all your introductions, because, you know, you all have, you know, I talk with all kinds of audiences, rural landowners, as well as a lot of master gardener audiences, residential audiences. So my goal here is to kind of cover the landscape in terms of, and focus on some of the, predominantly on deer and on voles, but as well as groundhogs and things, and kind of give you a way of maybe looking at some of these issues, as well as what are some of the controls. And a lot of this is around this whole realm of wildlife damage management. And just understanding the first important thing is to identify, you know, the damage, the species responsible, understand the biology, know the alternatives, and know the law that's surrounding those species. So what I'm going to be doing in this presentation is I'm going to talk about deer a little bit, and then I'll talk about as in terms of identification or biology, and then I'm going to switch over to voles. So I'm going to kind of cover both topics kind of right up against each other. I've just found that this is a better way to kind of cover more species than to kind of just do one at a time. And then, you know, if you have questions, put them in the box, in the chat box, and maybe Lynn can feel free to interrupt me, and if I can you know, answer them there. Otherwise, we probably best to wait till the majority of them to the end. But identifying damage is important. What's causing it? You know, early detection for many of the problems you're having with, you know, deer and other things. The earlier, the better. And because the longer wildlife gets used to being in your area and doing what it's doing, the harder it is to get rid of it. And of course, you know, what's causing the damage. And again, if I was in a room with a bunch of you, I would ask you what these things are, you know. And this is deer up here on the top, you know, ate off the top of this corn, deer browsing on the lower left, buck rubbing here. You can see my cursor. And of course, a beaver. But I would ask you to look at these two on the right, because many times, you know, people confuse rabbit damage with deer damage. And basically rabbit damage is the one on the right. They have, you know, incisors on the top and the bottom, so they make a nice clean cut. Deer only have them on the one side. So they basically, when they eat something, they rip it. So you get this characteristic of tearing of what you see on the left here. Now, of course, if it's, you know, many feet off the ground, you probably know it's deer, but in some cases you may have a rabbit problem and not realize it and think it is deer. So it's just one thing to look for. This is another thing. This is vole damage. This is actually, you can see the voles, basically it was snow here up until about this point, and they ate the bark underneath the snow. This shows you what they can do with a root system of a tree. This is a boxwood, and basically there's, you don't want to confuse, you know, voles with moles, okay, which is on the top left. But typically we have two species of voles, okay? They're called meadow mouse, and the meadow vole in the bottom is the most typical one you see. It has a real long tail, which is a characteristic to tell. and a pine vole, which is a much smaller one, but is more subterranean and tends to live underground. These can be real problematic, and you can see what they can do. This is some boxwood shrubs, and typically they're not going to eat woody tissue in the summertime. They're basically going to eat green stuff in the summertime. That's what they prefer. But if you have a lot of beds, and especially a lot of mulch is the big culprit, way too much mulch, they just love that habitat. So come September or so, they're going to start losing all the green vegetation. That's when they're going to start hitting the woodies. And I'll talk about trapping them out later and dealing with them, but that's when you want to get them before they're going into the winter and causing all kinds of damage with all kinds of crops, with herbs and everything else, trees, you name it. And you can see this is characteristic meadow voles on the top here. You can see the tunnels, okay? And they're going up under the foundation. Pine voles tend to have more, like they're more subterranean. You can see they have a hole just going into the ground. And but the pine voles, which will use the meadow vole tunnels, but the point is just learn to recognize these things. You'll see the tunnels, and you can find the frass. And again, I have fact sheets on a lot of this stuff, and I put that in the chat box to some of the resources that I have on these topics that you can use. And you can see this is from overwintering, basically under snow, and the voles just went crazy around these residential environments, and they can do the same around many of your beds. So you want to get them in September when the vegetation is changing and before they take those high populations into the fall. And a lot of tree plantings have basically been succumbed to vole damage, because there were voles in a lot of these old pastures that you see here, and a lot of these old abandoned lots full of voles. And if you start getting down in the grass, you'll find them and see them down there. Again, planting trees in that without controlling them is kind of a waste of time. You're wasting your money. And you can see this little, it's hard to see these little tunnels under there, but just a couple other things. Again, a couple other types of damage you might see. On the lower right is some vole damage. You can see the tunnels. If you have old pieces of cardboard or plywood on the ground, you pick it up, you'll see things like this. But also you'll see a lot of holes in the ground like this, and skunks very typically do that. They're looking for grubs underneath the ground. And again, don't confuse, voles, which are more of a grassland species and high grass, typically with moles, which will make these high, earthen tunnels like this. But moles are not going to really hurt you. Hurt your crops for the most part. They don't eat woody tissue, so they're looking for grubs and other things. So groundhogs, real problem. Anybody, maybe you have many problems with groundhogs. You can see this damage here on the right here. They've taken out part of this field, and everybody was probably going to ask me questions. What do you do about groundhogs? Well, honestly, you have to trap them and get rid of them. But you don't want to take them somewhere and drop them somewhere else. Actually, legally, that's against the law to trap and transplant wildlife without a permit from DNR. So, and it's not really humane either, because you're putting them under a lot of stress situations in a foreign environment. So we can talk about that a little bit later. For a lot of the critters you might have on your farms or in your back areas, and if you're not sure what they are, is to trap them. Mouse traps are great for that. Peanut butter, this is great for figuring out if you have voles or mice, the difference and things like this. Have-a-heart traps can be used as well. Putting those mouse traps along vole tunnels like this and covering them usually works pretty well. They don't like coming out in the light, so you need to cover them with something. They like to be in the dark. So understanding the biology is important. The behavior, all those kinds of things are very important. Their annual cycles, and we'll talk about that. And what we're going to talk about here really first is for the biology and thing is I'm going to talk about deer for a little bit and then talk about voles. Okay, so and a lot of things I want to say about deer are somewhat negative, but realize that deer are contribute a lot of positive quality of life benefits. They certainly bring in a lot of money to the economy for hunting, as well as wildlife watching and things like that. So I don't want to dismiss that. but they can become a real problem, like you see from this picture here under this old trampoline. So what do you do about that? Well, the thing about deer is they're extremely adaptive. You know, back in the 80s, you know, even the wildlife biologists thought that, you know, deer would basically be eradicated. They'd leave. They wouldn't be around anymore because they'd lose their habitat. But they didn't even understand how well the deer could adapt to the urban suburban environment. So just a couple of problems, of course, with deer is, you know, deer vehicle collisions. And I've worked with this in many areas of the state, and it's a big problem around the country. It's not just property damage; it's also loss of life and you know, people having lifelong injuries. So there's a lot of work being done in this regard. The other thing is Lyme disease. You know, they're not direct result, but they certainly carry the tick. The deer tick, which carries a spirochete, provide a blood meal as well as other animals do. And, you know, they tend to transport and carry them around pretty much everywhere. And once they're in an area, it's very difficult to, you know, of course, get rid of them. And you may have seen some of these 4-poster tick devices that are in some of the county parks now. They are basically corn feeders, and the deer stick their necks in there and on these rollers here with their pyrethrins there, and they kill the ticks. And they can be quite effective, but very expensive to operate, very expensive. So what is good deer habitat? Most people look at this picture on the lower right here and think, oh yeah, deer in the trees, they like the trees. Deer is really an early successional species. They like the, you know, the vegetation close to the ground so they can eat it and they have cover. And Maryland has the perfect landscape for it. You know, this rural landscape on the top, but we see the same thing in many of the urban environments with brush and of course all the fertilized lawns and things like that. So and of course the habitat changes with the season, so that many of the food sources that are available in the winter go away, and that means that they come to other areas. So they'll come to your yards, you know, a lot more in the winter perhaps than they will in the summer, when they could perhaps go other places. So this is a common question people ask is, how much do deer eat? Well, they eat about 3 or 4 pounds of vegetation a day. Okay. And you can take these numbers I have here and blow this up. But one thing I would recommend you do is take a black plastic bag, okay, and go around with a pair of clippers and start clipping off, you know, tips of trees or chips of branches, and fill up that bag with about 3 or 4 pounds of browse, and see how much it takes to do that. And you can see why our woods are basically being decimated, and biodiversity is being decimated by deer because of overabundant deer. And this is what it looks like. You see this all over the place. You know, they've overbrowsed the habitat. There's no vegetation there, all the regeneration. The habitat for wildlife is gone. And there's plenty of studies that document this loss of biodiversity. It always amazes me. People are concerned about biodiversity in the rainforest, but, you know, deer have just decimated in our backyards. And the reason is because deer, you know, overabundant deer are a keystone species. And that's a species on which other species in the ecosystem largely depend, such that if it were removed, the ecosystem would change dramatically. And that's what you see here with this unfenced area on the right. The deer basically eating everything in the understory. There's the loss of all the habitat for all other types of wildlife, okay? But on the left, where it's been fenced, that vegetation's come back, that habitat's come back. So plant the seed that for those of you that are having problems with deer, fencing works, okay? And this is an example from Baltimore County. On the other side of that fence there's no deer. It was fenced out. This is where there's deer. So fencing can have a dramatic effect. And I'll talk about a couple different types of fencing that's available that you probably should look at. Just a quick example of deer population dynamics. Let's just say you have a deer herd with a 3-to-1 ratio of bucks to does, does to bucks, which is not uncommon, especially in populations that are hunted. And let's say you have a hunting season, you harvest half of the does and half of the bucks. And of course, you know, assuming each of those female deer or doe produce 1.3 fawns, and that's extremely conservative. It's more closer to 2. But in this case, you have 12 new deer. You add that to the 12 remaining, you add the same number of deer. So my point here is that I'm not a professional wildlife biologist, but in talking with folks, you need to remove 40 to 50% of does in a population just to maintain the population from one year to next. So you can see how in your urban environments and suburban environments, deer are becoming extremely overabundant because there is no hunting in many cases except by automobiles, and basically these you see 1 or 2 deer, so there's 2 to 3, 4 to 5, so on and so forth. So this is a eye-opening to many people, and that's why many of these managed hunts, Howard, Montgomery County, and other areas that we really are encouraging counties to have managed hunts to reduce these overabundant deer to protect the environment. So anyway, that's on deer. A little bit about the biology of voles, okay? Voles are creatures of the tall grass. They like the tall grass. They like the cover. On lawns, that's where you're going to find moles. And moles, again, don't eat woody vegetation. They're eating bugs and insects and things like that. So most of your vole problems are going to be in areas where you have grass or you have lots of mulch or lots of soft earth where they can tunnel in. But you're going to have voles there too. And this is where knowing what the problem might be worth trapping some to make sure that you know what you got, or looking at some of the other resources so you can tell the difference. Just a couple things about voles. They're capable of dramatic population changes. So the meadow voles, which are the most common ones on the left, the longer tail, bigger body, 5 to 10 litters per year, about 5 litters of young per litter. Pine voles are a little bit less productive, sexually active very soon. And again, the thing is they eat plant parts. They like green succulent vegetation. But come fall, when that runs out, that's when they go after your woodies. That's when they're going to hit your crops that you might have in many cases, all your roots and things like that. So you need to find ways to get rid of them. And typically that's going to be, not encouraging rodenticides for most of the applications you have probably, but just a quick and dirty way is to use mouse traps with peanut butter and, hide them along the tunnels and cover them and start trapping them out in, around September when they're going to take bait. Most of what we know about voles comes from the apple business, apple orchards, especially up in New York and areas like that, where the threshold for the number of voles is extremely low, because this used to be an apple orchard and it was let go. They stopped herbiciding the strips with the trees. You can see where there's one tree left, and stopped, they regularly apply rodenticides on nurseries and things like that. So it only takes a few voles to kill a tree. And of course that tree is expected to produce for the next 10, 20 years. This is a call to you as well. Those of you who have fruit trees, and that kind of thing. You want to be very concerned about that. Your threshold may be very low for voles. And so let's look at tree plantations. Of course, I'm a forester and seen many of these tree plantations basically be eviscerated or just totally killed from voles. In other words, there were voles there before. They weren't, the trees are planted in the spring. They go through the summer quite okay usually because the voles are eating other things, and then come fall, they just hammer those plantations. And they'll do the same thing in residential landscapes where all of a sudden you notice all the trees are dying. Well, they've been dying since September when the voles have been working on them. So in this case, in many cases, I had to nuke the site and replant the trees, and big loss. So I've done a lot of work with forestry plantings to make foresters do an assessment for vole presence and either treat them culturally or chemically, depending on the situation, or combination of both, to deal with it. Otherwise, why are we wasting our money planting those trees? Groundhogs, just a few, everybody always asks about groundhogs. So this is just a few statistics about groundhogs. 700 pounds of dirt digging out of a 20, 25 foot den, and consume a lot of vegetable matter in a day. So that could be out of your vegetable garden, out of your herb garden. and the breeding season's in mid-February, and they start emerging, and basically they start moving out. And again, there's no easy answer. In some cases, firearms are allowed. Firearms can be used, but in other cases, it's trapping and euthanizing. But a lot of groundhogs just don't go well with a lot of urban farms. I can tell you that. They can cause a lot of losses. And they're typically an edge creature, so you're going to find them, and especially in a lot of urban environments where you have a lot of edge, and they're very resourceful. And of course, there are bombs that can be used, and other types of things that you can put in the holes, and there's a whole range of options. But many people have been thwarted with trying to get rid of groundhogs. It takes persistence. The biology of the pests relative to managing the problem is important. I think, how do populations respond when they're removal of animals in a given area? And that varies with size. And I mentioned this for deer and voles just to tell you that, when a lot of times with deer overabundance, but hunting programs and so on and so forth, the bucks tend to roam, and they're going to start to fill in a lot of those holes. So my point here is that if you are trying to remove deer with hunting and things like that, one season of doing that's not going to do it, because they're going to come in from other areas. So you're going to be kind of like this permeate approach, and after a while, you'll start to have a real impact, but it has to be a yearly effort. I think that's the point to be said. And in the case of voles, there's a lot of things that are positive for voles populations to increase, like you see here, immigration and so on, but also a lot of things that can be negative. And there's a whole list of items here in terms of predation, and I'll mention some of these items a little later on. One thing I would tell you about voles is that they will come in from other areas. So let's say you have a vole problem, you trap them out of a certain area. Well, if you're going to trap them, make sure you trapped out at the peripheral areas as well, because a lot of times they will come in, moving from other areas. That's what this graph shows you. And again, this comes from apple orchard work in New York. Even though the voles were, taken out, okay, after about 48 weeks, they reinvaded from adjacent areas. So just be aware of that. They will move in from other areas. So this is the good part. What are the alternatives, for deer and for voles? And I think I see somebody has their microphone on, I think. So not next door in Leroy's basement. I think somebody needs to mute. Good. Okay, so let's talk about deer. I have a number of resources on deer management publications. Admittedly, some of these need to be updated, but the information in them is still pretty good, with repellents and other things. And I'm just going to mention some of these things to you here. And when I talk about deer management, I tend to make it easy to understand by talking about wildlife damage management as kind of a combination of one of four areas. Population management, which is going to be typically hunting, but then you have fencing, managing the vegetation perhaps in some cases, and then using things like repellent and scare tactics. Okay, so let's look at each one of these. Okay, and the point I want to make is that for many of you in urban areas and with urban farms, realize that these non-lethal options, fencing, repellents, and vegetation management, 3 out of those 4 typically, don't deal with the root problem, which is overabundant deer. Okay, there's still too many deer. You're just pushing them off somewhere else. So, population management is going to come from traditional hunting, managed hunts. Deer contraception is not an option. I'm just telling you right now, I'm not going to get into it. It's just not an option, really. Of course, disease is an option, but we don't want that. We do see incidents of chronic wasting disease, but we really don't want to go there either. So my point for you that have a lot of deer problems is to make that known to your local government officials and encourage things like managed hunts on state and county parks and things like this, because that's going to be a benefit to the biodiversity overall, ecology overall, as well as to citizens in general with regards to vehicle accidents, Lyme disease, and everything else, as well as damage to landscapes or farms. So just a couple things about vegetation management, and really this is more about planting things that deer don't like. So if you're going to be putting in a landscape, or if you're a builder or something, you know, for goodness sakes, if you're not going to be fencing off the area, and you know you have a overabundant deer and a lot of deer pressure, don't plant things that deer like, okay? And we have a fact sheet on resistance of ornamentals to deer damage, things they prefer more than others. Now that doesn't mean they won't eat the other stuff, but there's a preference list for them. So you can minimize the damage if you're going to be, you know, don't plant rhododendrons and azaleas and yew bushes. That's like candy, okay? So unless you protect them, that's a waste of money. But, you know, boxwood, lilacs, butterfly bush, these are things that, you know, deer don't like. So I'm not going to go into what all these things are. You can look them up, but just understand the principle behind that. And here's some rarely damaged trees. And some of these will vary depending upon the area you are, but, you know, some of these may not be all that desirable. It just depends. So, you know, check some of these out. And again, if this was folks here, I would ask you, like, how many people here have used repellents? And we were very interested in this back many years ago and did some research in Montgomery County on commercial deer repellents. And we have a fact sheet on that, which is, and I think the basic principles in it still hold. But you look at repellents as an IPM approach, okay? Integrated pest management. In other words, you're evaluating the effectiveness of the repellents by their active ingredient. There's not that many active ingredients in repellents. They're mixed around, but some, you know, don't get so concerned with the trade name, except mix them up, you know. So the thing we know about repellents is they will fail. And if you really want to stop damage, you've got an economic interest or in what you're producing, put up a fence. 8 foot is minimum, you know, 9 to 10 foot is better. Most of them work by odor or taste. And you want to apply them typically, the repellents, as deer are changing their pattern. So in the fall, you know, late summer deer, the bucks start moving around, so that when they come into the area, they you know, they taste this nasty stuff, and they'll hopefully go to your neighbors. But you know, there are notoriously inconsistent results, and it depends on the availability of other foods. If I was a commercial producer, you know, I wouldn't be relying on repellents. I don't know commercial producers that rely on pellets. If they really need that protection, they're going to put up a fence, okay? Because deer are a long-term problem. Repellents are short-term. You get a really bad weather or really bad drought, the deer are going to be eating stuff anyway. And there's all, you know, all the money. They're not particularly cheap. It's basically a residential market. It's not a commercial market. But these are the chemicals, or the chemicals. They're just natural ingredients mostly. But putrescent egg-based, that's what most of the original ones were. Some are a fungicide, Thyrum. There's a whole mix of them that are edible animal proteins, basically meat renderings, and the stuff stinks to high heaven, fish and stuff like that. Some of them are based on tastes, like Bitrix, very, 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 very bitter stuff. I mean, you got to wear gloves to use it. And then some combinations. Don't waste your time with stuff like pepper and garlic. I've never seen that stuff really work too well, but there's a lot of things out there, but these are the main ones that are out there. So, you know, make sure if you're in, this is in the managing deer damage guide that's on our website. All the stuff I'm talking about is basically in that publication on managing deer damage. So just understand, you want to mix it up. You want to use different repellents, you know, if you're going to be using them. Keep them guessing. And if you are going to buy them, don't buy the ready to use, you know, buy concentrates online. They're incredibly cheaper. This is just a couple of examples. These are old examples, but it's still, the principle holds. It'd be much cheaper. We did this study in Montgomery County, you know, with yew bushes and azaleas. We staked them in the ground and put applications on in January, and then we took pictures of them to see how much vegetation was being browsed off each of the samples, and randomly assigned repellent treatments. And we used what was cutting edge there, digital photography against a white background, to show how, as the deer ate the vegetation, the pixels decrease. And what we got is, overall, is that the untreated controls, you know, had a whole lot more herbivory than the treated ones. And so we found, basically, and again, you can read about this in the fact sheet that's there, but they worked, okay? How well they worked and how acceptable that was going to be, but deer have this uncanny ability. This shows the applications on this one site. This is when they were applied in January. These were the different repellents, okay? These were the controls. So the deer have this uncanny ability. They can just pick it out and know the ones that are untreated. And then they just hammered them. You know, you can see the plant percent remaining, just hammered them. So, you know, I'll just leave it up to you. It may be useful in some of your applications where deer are not that big of a problem. But you know, wintertime is going to be your biggest problem. No question about it. Because summertime, they have other foods. Maybe you can scare them off to eat. And this was just, I'm going to go with that. But basically what we found is that the deer browsing, you know, was January to April. We could get up to 12 weeks. It's maybe 7 weeks, depending upon bad weather and stuff like that. What we did find is that these repellents worked pretty good in Montgomery County, Carroll County, along the Piedmont area and the coastal plain. But once you got up into the mountains of Allegheny, Garrett County, and Western Washington County, the winters are too bad, and basically they were pretty much ineffective. So found a similar case up in Cornell in New York State. So this was this 4-poster treatment stand up in that you see these in Howard County. I'm not sure if they're using them in PG County or not, but you can see before treatment, these are all ticks. And then the perrethrins, they stick their head necks through there, and the perrethrins, you know, basically gets on the fur and works its way back and, you know, kill the ticks. So, but just very, very expensive to do. So that's the issue with that. Kind of a problem. And in fact, this was an example. You know, the bait station costs $800. You're feeding them 100 pounds of corn. You know how much, you know, so many pounds per deer, so much per day. So the point of this, to feed 40 deer was about $3,650 per year. So these are very expensive things to maintain. They may work in areas where you have high concentrations of day users and children and stuff like that, but you know, not something for most people that they're going to use. The other thing I'll mention is repellents is, you know, a lot of scare tactics. There's a lot of things out there. This one's up the top is called the dog in a box. And basically, most of these things are based with motion detectors, and either they make noise like the one on the upper top, or the one on the lower left that sprays a hose. The one on the right, you know, puts out a real high-pitched sound that people can't hear, but deer hear. Most of these things deer habituate to. They're not cheap. They can cost hundreds of dollars, and I've just never seen them really be effective over the long term. So I would tend to stay away from them. And I've also stayed away from these. Deer whistles, just there's no research to show they work. And it basically gives people a sense of confidence they should not be having. If you're driving at night in a high deer area, you should be driving slow, keeping your eyes on the side of the road, not, you know, going like a bat out of hell because, you know, you got your deer whistles on the bumper. So that's a recipe for disaster. So just so you know about that. We've also done work with you know, dogs within invisible fences, and a lot of people here probably have an invisible fence in their yard and say, oh, well, my dog's going to keep the deer away. Well, the problem with that is that most people's dogs, well, when are deer big? The biggest problem is at night. Okay. And where is Fido at night? Well, he isn't outside chasing deer. He's outside, he's inside by the couch. So, you know, we've worked with systems of pairs of dogs on like 20 to 30 acres with nurseries and pick your own operations. And these are rescue dogs. And, you know, they have automatic feeders and waterers, but they're work dogs. They stay out there 24 hours a day, and they're taken care of. There's a vet protocol and all this stuff. There's a number of nurseries and orchards, you know, that use these, and they can be quite effective. You have a pair of dogs. They have to be visited by humans, some, you know, regular contact and vet care. They can be quite effective, but, you know, you have to like dogs, because what happens if you get this dog, these rescue dogs, right? And they don't work out. One doesn't work out, and that happens. What do you do with the dog? You take it back to the pound? Probably not. So for people that like animals, these can be quite effective. This is Blairland Farms. You may have heard of this. They have dogs There were some other farms as well, nurseries that have used them. So typically in high value operations, they can be, we had some research that we did at our farm a number of years ago, and there's a fact sheet on my publications page about that as well. So in fact, this was from that study. It was many years ago at this point, but you know, we couldn't grow fruit trees because of the deer. And now we could have fenced them, but this we were trying to see if the system worked, and it did work. And these dogs were ruthless. I mean, they killed a lot of groundhogs, raccoons, countless voles, as well as kept the deer away. So you know, it does work. But what we found, just to boil this down, basically, while it's an initial investment, is relatively cheap, because you only have to, you know, wire and a collar, and right now it's GPS stuff typically. It doesn't even have wire. You know, you still have all the costs of maintaining the dogs, feeding them, vet bills, and all that. So if you look at the cost of that, between that and putting up a fence, you know, they're going to be somewhat similar after 20 years. So just something to think about. So let's talk about fencing. This is the gold standard for fencing now, is a 9 to 10 foot solid lock fixed knot fence, not electric. We went through a number of years with electric fences, and deer just learned how to compromise them. They would pull themselves up and go through, and so most serious growers, commercial growers, are going with fixed knot fences. You don't have a problem with electric. They're very sturdy. You know, things can fall on them and still not crush them. So, you know, this is what's out there, and but they're not cheap. Okay, you know, maybe, you know, $6 or $7 a linear foot, but then you got to add in the cost of corners and gates, and a deer guard like this, you know, is $1,000. You know, so depending upon your operation, but the important thing to remember with all these types of fencing operations, especially, is it's all based on a cost benefit. And the question you have to ask as a grower is, how much am I losing to deer? And that's the question many people don't ask themselves, because, okay, so if this was for a large producer, $30,000 a year, but the question is, how much are you losing per year? And you'd be surprised, you're losing more than you think. So how much does the fence cost? How long does the payback period? That's the question you need to ask yourself about fencing. And there's a couple different kinds of fencing, and I'll mention another one, but the fixed knot is the gold standard. But plastic fencing, this fencing's been around for a number of years. It's really quite good. It's light, it's easy to install. It blends in with the woods. Anybody can put this up pretty much. And it comes in all different types and gauges. And the company that does a lot of this work now has done a lot of marketing and product development, is deerbusters.com. And that's where I usually send people, because they have a lot of different products, but they have plastic coated metal wire fences, a lot of options, okay, not just plastic fencing like you see on the left there. So this shows you, it basically can be put up, you put the posts up, you put wires up on the bottom, up on the top, I mean, a wire in the middle and a wire in the bottom, and basically you use plastic ties to hang the fence from the wires. And deer will get through it, and it can be fixed relatively easy. But there is a lot of maintenance involved with these fences. So you get snow and ice sometimes, but you know, for small operations, this is quite effective and quite cost effective. You know, most of this fencing's maybe $1 or so, $1.50 a linear foot. That doesn't include the posts, which are the most expensive part of that. But this has been used in a lot of different applications, and especially for small operations. And again, the good thing is, if you put it up against a wooded backdrop, the black, you don't even barely see it. In fact, you have to put, as you can see here, my pointer, you can see the flagging. You need to put flagging up just so the deer can see it. You know, make sure that they see it. They don't run into the fence. In fact, that's my daughter now, who just turned over 30 years old. So that's an old picture. So this fencing's been around for a while, and most of it comes from Italy. But there's a number of different products that have come out that have spurred on from it. And again, you can get all kinds of gates and corners, and that's going to drive the price up. There's no question about it. but you can keep deer out of these, and you can get 9 to 10 foot on these fences. They can be quite effective. So I encourage you, for those that really have serious deer problems, this would probably be the most cost-effective option for most of you in many cases to look at. If you don't want to get into the cost of $6, $7, $8 a linear foot for something more permanent. The other option is these small polywire fences that are basically hooked up to an electric charger. And these are basically, high voltage, low impedance electric chargers, short pulse, short duration, number of pulses per minute. They can run on battery, AC. I always suggest people hook up to an AC if they can, even if it means running a wire underground for, a ways to get to it, because it's just more reliable and they're cheaper, and you get a lot more power, and power is measured in joules of energy for the dollar. So again, you can read about this, but a lot of this is using polytape or polywire. And this is plastic with filament through it. For those of you who have horses or sheep, it's a similar material used for those grazing animals, and it just connects the current. And basically, we've done this with these fences, these polywire fences, which are not physical barriers. They're psychological barriers. So there's one about this, about 36 inches, and one below there about halfway. And usually the fences are baited with flagging, like metal flagging, flashing, with peanut butter in between it. And the idea here is, and there is some commercial projects like you see on the right, but basically you're attracting the deer to the fence. So it's like a little kid with a stove. They're going to get there, they're going to touch it with their noses, which is the only part of the deer that's not really insulated, and they get nabbed with a quick duration of some high voltage, and they stay away. And these fences can be quite effective in many areas. And I used it here on this old apple orchard, applying these apple trees. It's been used in gardens all over the place. You see on the right there, in this case on the lower right is, actually they were concerned about deer coming in, bucks coming into the big windows they had. Christmas tree plantations, orchards, some small farm crops. You say, how can that keep a deer out? Well, again, you're psychologically training them. You put it up, you electrify it right away. They may knock it down, but you'd be checking it regularly. And the big problem with these fences is, well, there's different arrangements. You can see a double polywire here in this case to kind of give them this depth perception. There's all kinds of Rube Goldberg ways to mess with it. But the biggest Achilles heel of this is snow. So the reason the animal gets shocked is because its hooves in the ground, touches the body, makes electrical current. And, when you have snow's the insulator. So these fences are quite effective for a lot of summer operations. And I really encourage you to try it. For home gardens, it's the best thing since sliced bread. I mean, really, you'd be surprised how it can make deer. So if you have a lot of these small summer plantings, and you say, well, you worry about pets and children, but this isn't like the chargers of yesteryear that you touch it and hold it like it electrocutes you. These are, you touch it, it immediately throws you off it. So even animals, and frankly, even if a human were to touch it, they just wouldn't touch it again. It's not going to cause physical harm. So something for you to think about: polywire, polytape fences. And this is just a comparison, rough comparisons between the cost per labor and the cost per foot. And it's really a linear foot, then of course you have to add in the cost of gates and all that kind of stuff. So let's see where we are in time. I want to finish up here. Metal fencing for groundhogs, you can get hardware cloth like this, bury that in the ground, bring it out about a foot or so. That can help dissuade groundhogs. And in fact, you can use polywire fences as well. You put wires really close to the ground, and I've done that too, to keep groundhogs and rabbits out. You have to keep it taut, you have to keep the vegetation away, and control the vegetation so it doesn't short out, but that can work. I'll just mention hunting, that that is the most economical, practical method of deer population regulation. And so that's not a non-lethal control, but again, I encourage you to look at this as an option and encourage this with your with your local government officials with managed hunts. But you can also use crop damage permits. And I'll just say that, you know, there's all kinds of hunting seasons for archery, muzzleloader, and things like that. And Montgomery County, Howard County, I know they have managed hunts on government properties, and they're quite effective. And they've been very effective at reducing deer populations in many areas of those counties. So if you have a county which doesn't have this type of program, I encourage you to contact them and ask about it. Sharpshooters are very expensive. That's really more in high urban areas. But the thing that most of you are qualified for, if you're a farm, if you can qualify as an agricultural operation, or if you have a written forest stewardship plan, you can get crop damage permits where, you know, deer, mostly female deer, can be harvested year round. You just need to contact the Maryland DNR Wildlife Division, and they'll issue permits to commercial growers. Question is, will they see you as a commercial grower, as a small urban farmer, if that's even something you're interested in, or can you actually, you know, hunt in the area you're in? Those are all issues. But just to say that Maryland is very proactive in working with growers to manage and reduce the deer population down to lower levels. So, and just to give you an idea, I picked these numbers out of the last deer report from PG County. There was a total of harvested of 2,196 deer in 1919 to the winter of 2020, out of almost 80,000 from Maryland. But if you look at crop damage permits, there was only about 212 deer compared to statewide over 10,000. So just interesting numbers. And you can see where you know, PG County is a shotgun county only in terms of firearms, but of course archery is allowed and things like that. So just a tidbit of information for you. What I would tell you is if you live in urban areas, by law, you know, you have to be 150 yards typically from the nearest dwelling to hunt, okay? But in some of the counties, they've reduced that length, but if you have written permission from your neighbors, you can basically hunt off your back porch. I mean, so that's how that works. And this does allow hunting in subdivisions, but of course, one person within that 150-yard area is going to, you know, be a problem, right? So just, you know, if you do have the option for hunting, I'd encourage that. I'm going to just finish up by talking just quickly about vole management options. And those 4 management options are cultural, you know, trapping. And gosh, I really apologize that I've gone about my time here, but just to quick things about voles. This is kind of a summary. The easiest way to deal with voles is to remove the habitat, mowing the grass, using herbicide strips, minimize mulching. Instead of, you know, volcano mulching and 3 to 5 inches of mulch, that's what's going to get you in trouble. Encourage predators, provide perches for hawks and owls, and don't kill snakes, especially black snakes. They just eat a lot of rodents. And if you do have a problem, the best way in most cases is going to be in landscapes in small areas that most of you are probably used to working in, is to use is to use mouse traps. You know, put them on like a 10 by 10 or 5 by 5 grid pattern. You know, hide them like I told you before, cover them, put them, you know, perpendicular to some trails, put peanut butter on them, and basically just keep, as they keep, you know, getting caught, you know, dispose of them. So commercial applications, I'm not going to get really into that, but you have to be a commercial applicator typically to use rodenticides, and requires a pesticide certification. So that's a totally different animal. And I'm just going to give you a few pictures here about, you know, this is a problem. A lot of people take all these wood chips and they'll pile them up around. Boy, voles getting there, watch out. You know, total coverage landscapes. In this case, this is an apple orchard where they have herbicide strips and mow the grass. Good thing. Cats are good. Snakes are good. Owls and hawks. But these don't deal with an acute problem. If you have an acute problem, you're going to have to either look at the use of rodenticides or, you know, trapping is typically the most common way. And again, just to reiterate, the most effective time that you want to trap is starting in probably September, you know, when all the green vegetation is dying out and they're looking for food, they're getting hungry. That's when they're going to take bait. You know, that's when they're going to go into traps and typically be more likely to, not that you can't do it other times, but that's going to, when you're going to get, and you want, most importantly, you want to get them out of the area before fall and winter, because then they're going to just hammer all your other stuff. So this is kind of an example of, some traps and along a path here, covering it up. You could use a shingle, coffee cans, whatever. Sticky pet straps. I know some people would say those are inhumane, but there's a lot of options. And this trapping with skunks and woodchucks and squirrels. I remember it's really illegal to take these animals and take them elsewhere on someone else's property. I just don't encourage. I don't think it's really humane, because there's a lot of stress to these animals, and the right thing to do really is to euthanize these animals. There's of course a number of different ways to do that. So anyway, I'm not going to go into into thing, but the last final thing is to know the law and complying with state and federal regulations with regards to pesticides and all these other things. And fencing, some counties have ordinances against 8 to 10 foot fences. In many counties like Montgomery County, I think they've actually got the county to change their ordinances because the deer are such a problem. And that's another thing you can do as well. So anyway, this is our website. We just redid everything, University of Maryland websites, extension.umd.edu/woodland. And I put some of those resources in the chat. So this is our new address, actually, go.umd.edu/woodland, taking you to the same place. And you'll find a lot of information there. We have the YouTube recordings and publications and all that kind of stuff. So with that, I will thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.